Thanks, Lisa. Really thrilled to be here. Very excited to be in such great company. Grateful to Lisa and Aaron and the organizers. Grateful to Heritage for hosting us, all the supporters of the conference. It's really meaningful to be in community at this particular moment to learn about all the exciting work that's happening. And since our theme of the conference is crafting the dream, I thought I could invite you to start the day with a daydream. If you picture yourself in January 1944 on Canal Street on the Lower West Side, it's about a 20-minute subway ride from here. Picture yourself ducking into a secondhand bookstore and bric-a-brac shop. Among the crockery and phonograph records, you discover canvases by Alice Neal, Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko. You collect them in your arms, you take them to the cash register, and the owner rings you up for about $3 per painting. So it's every collector's fantasy, it's every curator's fantasy. Where do I point this? Anywhere, Jenner? Should be good. Great, excellent. Thanks, Kevin. Grateful to the tech support, making everything happen. So you find this overlooked Pollock, Rothko in the secondhand store, but this fantasy in reality marked the ignominious end to a decade-long experiment in government-funded art. Those canvases were the cast-offs of the Roosevelt administration's efforts to help unemployed artists through the job-creating agency, the Works Progress Administration. So this story hit the pages of Life magazine in April of 1944 with the scathing headline, "End of WPA Art. Canvases which cost the government $35 million are sold for junk." Worse was to come. With the triumph of post-war abstract expressionism, it was decided that WPA art was not only sold for junk, it really was junk. Jackson Pollock, who got his start on the WPA, later scorned the absurd idea of an isolated American painting that was so popular in the country during the 30s. Arshile Gorky, who painted 10 abstract murals for Newark Airport under the auspices of the Federal Art Project, didn't mince words. He said New Deal art was poor art for poor people. In 1967, the author of Thames and Hudson's American Art Since 1900 concluded that, quote, "the WPA programs produced almost no art of any consequence that has survived." So it is with a little bit of satisfaction that 60 years later, nearly 60 years, Thames and Hudson is finally allowing a rejoinder. It's New Deal art, culture in crisis in the Great Depression. Thanks so much, Lisa, for the plug. In writing the general audience survey of the 1930s art programs, I had the benefit of all the great scholarship that's been done in the decades since Rose's book. So the bibliography in the book lists the cumulative work of scholars and curators who've illuminated the promises and pitfalls of New Deal art, some of whom, like Erica Doss, Jackie Francis, are here today. So many to name, but just a few who really inform my thinking about this period. Marianne Kalo, John Ott, Jody Patterson, Helen Lenga, Andrew Hemingway, Barbara Haskell, the list goes on. So with their help, I thought we could think together a little bit this morning about the legacy of the New Deal, what lessons we might take away, what thoughts for the future. And I think it's just worth mentioning that for starters, artists of great talent, I would say genius, if we're willing to use the word, made indelible works on the federal art programs. So Bernice Abbott's classic of documentary photography, Changing New York, Lester Beale's strikingly modernist posters for the Rural Electrification Administration, Suzanne Chapman's trompe-l'oeil Index of American Design watercolors, Stuart Davis's eye-popping swing landscape, Aaron Douglas's epic Aspects of Negro Life, Sergeant Johnson's relief sculptures for the California School for the Blind that we heard about yesterday from Jackie, Gordon Parks's iconic classic American Gothic, Ben Shaw's murals for the Social Security building in Washington, D.C., Doc's Thrash's carborundum prints made in Philadelphia. The list goes on. And none would have been possible without the support of the New Deal art programs. But I think it might miss the point, as tempting as it would be to argue that the 1930s simply offered a decade of overlooked great art. I think that's true, but I think the legacy of the art programs goes beyond rare occasional masterpieces, in the phrase of Federal Art Project Director Holger Cahill. It's the ongoing effort to reimagine the relationship between art and society. It's the dream of cultural democracy, art by the people, for the people. And we should remember that that dream came out of a nightmare, the Great Depression. James Rosenberg had a front row seat to the economic apocalypse. A bankruptcy lawyer by day, he was in Manhattan on Black Tuesday, the 29th of October, 1929, when the US stock market collapsed. An artist by night, Rosenberg escaped the Wall Street inferno, as he recalled, to forge a hallucinatory lithograph in the heat of panic. Lightning splits the sky over buckling skyscrapers. A chaotic crowd rushes to escape the carnage. The words Dies Irae hover in the storm clouds, day of wrath. Reginald Marsh, got a shout out from Lisa, etched the unemployed queuing up in bread lines as shockwaves of financial panic radiated from Wall Street to Main Street. Banks failed, factories shuttered, businesses folded, workers were handed the dreaded pink dismissal slip. Savings evaporated. There was no social safety net, no social security, unemployment benefits, or deposit insurance to catch the falling. When asked if anything like the Great Depression had happened before, the British economist John Maynard Keynes said, yes, the Dark Ages, and it lasted 400 years. Artists were among the most vulnerable to the economic shock. Commercial galleries closed and private patronage dried up. Phil Bard's drawing for the journal Artfront finds an impoverished painter slumped in front of an easel beneath a dangling sword of Damocles, symbol of the looming threat of hunger. Unsold canvases lean against the back wall. Long isolated from the rest of society, wrote painter George Biddle, the artists joined their fellow men on the bread lines and in the relief stations. George Biddle was a schoolmate of FDR at Groton and Harvard, and he encouraged the president in a now famous 1933 letter to look to Mexico as a model for government-sponsored art. In Biddle's view, artists like Diego Rivera had been able to express a, quote, common social faith or purpose in public murals representing the ideals of the Revolutionary Republic. But Biddle's letter expressed ideas in much wider circulation, that support for artists should be part of the economic recovery, that art could spiritually fortify a nation reeling from the Depression, that it could help restore public confidence in the state and the economy. These ideas set in motion an audacious experiment, hard to imagine today. Between 1933 and 1943, the US government, for the first and last time, subsidized art on a massive scale, opening the floodgates of creativity nationwide through a series of programs: the Public Works of Art Project, the Treasury Section of Fine Arts, and the Federal Art Project. The first, the Public Works of Art Project, operated as an emergency relief program from December 1933 to spring 1934. The agency hired artists to make work for tax-funded buildings, and the obvious question arose: what would they make? What would they paint? The subject matter assigned to them, wrote Edward Bruce, the program's director, was the American scene in all its phases. Within this scope, the artists were given the utmost freedom of expression. That was a bit like Henry Ford saying his customers could have a car in any color so long as it was black. What exactly did the American scene look like? The strategically vague term encompassed the country's history and landscapes, myths and legends, prosperous industries, and rural folkways. Bruce's own painting industry supplied a template, a recognizable American scene done in a style not too modern, not too academic, not too romantic, not too polemical. Assistant director Edward Rowan expected common sense to prevail, noting that, quote, any artist who paints a nude for the Public Works of Art Project should have his head examined. Rowan was friends with Grant Wood. They had founded a short-lived Iowa art residency together in 1932, and the American scene bore a family resemblance to regionalism, the movement associated with the Midwestern triad of Wood, Thomas Hart Benton, and John Stewart Curry. Wood served as state chairman of the Iowa PWAP, convinced the program would help free artists from what he saw as the corrupting influence of European modernism by rooting American art in heartland virtues, exemplified by his wholesome murals for Iowa State College, now university. Other artists like Aaron Douglas had a different view of the American scene. The PWAP sponsored his mural cycle, Aspects of Negro Life, for the Harlem Branch Library up at 135th Street, now the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Featuring Douglas's signature silhouettes in radiating concentric circles, like water ripples disturbing the smooth surface of the past. The epic cycle traces Black American history from Africa through enslavement, emancipation, and the Great Migration to industrial cities in the North. In the panel From Slavery Through Reconstruction, a towering orator, a symbol of emboldened Black suffrage and self-determination, points to a distant city on a hill, the unfulfilled promise of America's more perfect union. Douglas's American scene, riven by the contradictions of freedom and slavery, suffrage and suffering, gave visionary form to Langston Hughes's refrain, "I too sing America." Douglas was one of the nearly 4,000 artists paid a living wage through the PWAP to make some 15,000 artworks for tax-funded buildings. A major exhibition in Washington, D.C. garnered praise and a broad consensus that taxpayer dollars had been well spent. The president and first lady even selected a group of paintings for the White House staff offices. This success opened the door to other government initiatives to support artists. The Treasury section of Fine Arts was established in October 1934 with Bruce at the helm to carry forward the PWAP's momentum. The section sponsored design competitions to hire artists to make art for federal buildings, mostly post offices. In many small towns, a post office mural was possibly the only original artwork the community could enjoy. And Virginia Snedeker, herself a section muralist, pokes fun at this phenomenon in her 1941 New Yorker cover. A yellow-smocked painter on a ladder puts the finishing touches on a mural. An airmail pilot soars with angelic wings above a Pony Express rider, rearing back on a white charger, brandishing an envelope like a trophy. A humble crowd in aprons and overalls considers the grandiose mural with mild bemusement. Murals commissioned by the section of Fine Arts, some 1,100 in total, are so ubiquitous they are easy to overlook. What is visible may seem innocuous, following the risk-averse American scene template, local history, regional industries, and landscapes. The mural may look something like Louis Emerson Ronnebeck's The Fertile Land Remembers, painted in 1938 for the post office in Warland, Wyoming, a small town along the Bighorn River. Pioneers sit enthroned like the Holy Family in a covered wagon. Above them, native bison hunters drift like fugitive storm clouds. Past and present blur and cinematic dissolves. Native peoples displaced by white settlers, whose homesteading gives way to the modern world of oil derricks and transmission towers. The ostensibly straightforward mural raises more questions than it answers. Is the pioneer family the past or future? Is modern industry to be celebrated or lamented? What is it exactly that the fertile land, whose land, remembers? Nearly a quarter of section murals depict Native Americans, mostly by white artists, with a few notable exceptions. Woody Crumbo is one of 6 indigenous artists commissioned to paint murals for the Department of Interior building in Washington, D.C. Quote, "I'm attempting to record Indian customs and legends now," Crumbo said of his paintings, "while they are alive, to make them a part of the great American culture before these too become lost." Crumbo's work, and that of other Native New Deal artists, gave form to what scholar Gerald Visner has called indigenous survivance, survival plus resistance. And I would encourage you all, if you're interested in this topic, the Smithsonian has a great website, assuming it's still online, Indians at the Post Office, and it's really an indispensable resource on the topic. And also Jennifer McLaren's book, New Deal for Native Art. Section muralists were expected to deliver palatable American scenes, and they were faced with the task of reconciling fundamental contradictions between the myths and realities of American history: peaceful settlement and violent conquest, freedom and slavery, prosperous industry and labor strife, progress and poverty. So I'd encourage you to keep an eye out next time you're at your local post office if there's a section mural there. Complicated, contradictory arguments about American history, identity, and democracy might be hiding in plain sight, You might catch Jared French queering the American scene with a lusty knot of coal miners. You might spot Harold Lehman sneaking Union buttons into the caps of his railroad repairmen. They were too small to be seen in the sketches submitted to section officials for approval. Section murals are often thought of as WPA art, but technically the section was not part of the jobs creating program. Artists didn't have to prove they needed work. So this emphasis on quality, granting commissions to artists based on perceived merit, distinguished the section from the federal art projects concerned with quantity, giving jobs to as many unemployed artists as possible. The Federal Art Project, along with the theater, music, and writers projects, began operating in October 1935 as part of Federal One, the cultural arm of the Works Progress Administration. Between 1935 and 1943, 10,000 artists from coast to coast in big cities and small towns produced some 2,500 murals, 17,000 sculptures, and over 100,000 easel paintings. Hundreds of thousands of prints came off the presses through the Graphic Arts Division, which also made advances in screen printing and color lithography. The poster division printed over 2 million posters based on 35,000 designs. The Index of American Design documented in exquisite watercolor over 18,000 decorative and folk art objects, which are now in the collection of the National Gallery. The Federal Art Project expanded the definition of American art to include industrial design, folk art, and art by self-taught artists and children. Needless to say, support for artists was not a foregone conclusion. Few would have questioned the value of putting people to work, building bridges, paving roads, laying sidewalks. But there was a question and a pushback about making paintings or sculptures. And when he was criticized for giving jobs to artists, the WPA chief, Harry Hopkins, famously barked, "Hell, they've got to eat just like other people," which wasn't exactly a resounding endorsement. So it really fell to the artists on the project to prove the social benefit and utility of the work they were making, because they relied on annual appropriations from Congress to keep going. So it was always kind of on the cutting block. It's important to remember that the creative flourishing came out of poverty, hunger, and desperation. Alice Neel was among the first artists to join the government programs and one of the last to be dropped from the rolls. She said simply, "I don't know how I would have eaten without the WPA's support." Before the New Deal, private charities like the Russell Sage Foundation aimed to address poverty, but Neel was unimpressed. She said the foundation never gave a penny to the poor, but they investigated the poor. Neel attended and then painted such an investigation, which looks more like an inquisition. A seated woman in a black dress, likely a widow, had been living with her children, Neel remembered, under an overturned automobile. The investigators sit in various shades of judgment. A red square sets the scene in a key of wounded shame. Artists on the government payroll, however grateful for the lifeline that was thrown to them by the New Deal, came to know this scene well and to identify with the woman under investigation. To be eligible to work on the Federal Art Project, artists had to prove they were really and truly destitute. An applicant could have no assets or property, no savings, stocks or bonds, insurance policies, real estate, or family money. The social stigma was real. For Ben Shahn, the FAP had an aura of poverty about it, and Anton Refrigé admitted that, quote, "We were all very conscious of the fact that we were part of millions of unemployed." Federal Art Project kept unemployed artists from starving. That's the essential fact. But Neel also called it a great creative venture, acknowledging that it went far beyond the mandate to put hungry artists to work. The project transformed the artist's role in society. The stereotype of the artist as dissolute bohemian, eccentric genius, or social malcontent gave way to a new concept, the artist as worker, as Joe Jones proudly portrayed himself. So the very desperation that qualified artists for government aid also roused their sense of solidarity with the poor, fellow laborers, and each other. Anton Refrigé's mural celebrating the Federal Art Project for the 1939 World's Fair, you see the study on the screen, zigzags upwards from a muralist painting to a sculptor chiseling to a mason bricklaying. And the continuity between artist and bricklayer shows the New Deal efforts as mutually reinforcing. The artist is worker, the worker is artist. The brick wall had another meaning, to show that the Federal Art Projects are aimed at the people, as Refrigé put it, out in the streets, in their daily lives, unlike the museums, art galleries, or lecture halls where most people never go, for this is out of the pattern of their lives. Refugee expressed the project's central concern with cultural democracy, making art a part of the pattern of people's everyday lives. An attempt to bridge the gap between the American artist and the American public, FAP Director Cahill claimed, has governed the entire program at the Federal Art Project. Art, which had long catered to elite audiences in urban centers, should be widely accessible as a shared resource, like education, electricity, or clean water. To this end, art spread beyond the private gallery and museum. It occupied alleyways, subways, the walls of high schools, libraries, prisons, hospitals. The FAP established over 100 community art centers spanning the country from Cape Cod to the Oregon coast. Millions of Americans who had never set foot in a museum or gallery gained access to original art and art education through government funding. In the conversation yesterday with Stephanie and Dakota and Bob, made me think that we're in this moment again in a way. How can we make museums accessible? How can we make them comfortable places for people to be, not kind of alienating and distancing? So a lot of the themes and ideas that curators are grappling with today actually make me think of the 1930s and some of and this moment. The Harlem Community Arts Center and Chicago's Southside Community Arts Center offered under-resourced communities the chance to make and see original art. They became vibrant, creative hubs. Eleanor Roosevelt attended the Harlem Community Arts Center's opening, and in its first 6 months, over 70,000 people participated in the center's programs and events, including lectures, exhibitions, free classes in painting, sculpture, printmaking, and ceramics. William H. Johnson, who taught at the center, took inspiration from his young students in unlearning outworn formulas and reinventing his artistic identity. Jacob Lawrence, who was barely out of his teens, took classes at the HCAC before joining New York's Federal Art Project in 1938. HCAC director Gwendolyn Bennett believed the center offered a vision of a new and better world, but it was a vision born of struggle. HCAC was established through the efforts of the Harlem Artists Guild, which was founded in 1935 as an advocacy group by artists that included Aaron Douglas, Augusta Savage, and Romare Bearden. Bearden's 1935 illustration for the crisis shows a group of Black Americans overlooking marchers on the road to recovery. They carry banners lettered with New Deal acronyms, PWA, NRA, AAA, suggesting these agencies left African Americans behind. Although over 250,000 Black Americans worked for the WPA, and it has been understood and seen to be part of the Black electorate's historic transfer of loyalty in the 1930s from the Republican Party of Lincoln to the Democrats, they faced discrimination. Last hired, first fired, the saying went. They were also assigned, in many cases, the most menial and the lowest paid jobs. We also have the Roosevelt administration to thank for policy of redlining through the Federal Housing Authority that got started then. As Marianne Kalo argued in her recent book on African Americans and New Deal art, gains by Black artists were hard fought. So the story of New Deal art, we should remember, I think, is not just one of government largesse and grateful artists. There's this aspect of struggle and activism very much a part of it. And at the same time, holding these multiple ideas in our heads at once, artists like Jacob Lawrence later praised the New Deal for expanding opportunities for young artists. He was one of many to achieve post-war fame who cut their teeth on the government programs. Or I mentioned Alice Neal, Pollock, Gorky, Willem de Kooning, Philip Guston, Lee Krasner, Louise Nevelson, Sama Noguchi, Mark Rothko, David Smith, Charles White, just to name a few. The living wage meant they did not have to compete with one another for private patrons. A prudent couple could survive handily, one painter recalled, if they ate with caution and watered down the gin. Workshops and studios provided access to materials and the chance to experiment with new skills and techniques. Artists enjoyed a sense of shared purpose and the attention of the public, the press, and elected officials. Looking back at my 3 years on the project, Charles White remembered, the most wonderful thing for me was the feeling of cooperation with other artists, of mutual help instead of competitiveness, and of cooperation between the artist and the people. Russia-born Moses Sawyer remembered the WPA as giving artists a feeling of belonging, of being useful members of society. It was a fine and hopeful period for American art, he said. His artists on WPA captured this hopeful spirit. Artists and assistants worked together on a mural scheme for the children's ward of a Brooklyn hospital. The artists appear relaxed but focused, far from the stereotypical view of artists as isolated geniuses or antisocial bohemians. Sawyer, along with his artist brothers Raphael and Isaac, was one of the many artists on the programs who had immigrated to the United States. Others were the children of immigrants, and a significant number, like the Sawyer brothers, from Jewish families fleeing violent anti Semitism in the crumbling Russian Empire. Many came from working class backgrounds, and whether by birth or commitment, a number of New Deal artists embraced pro labor subjects. The utopian vision of Sawyer's Artisan WPA was, in fact, hard won, the product of organizing, protesting, bargaining. Sawyer belonged to the Artists Union, formed in 1934 to advocate for better working conditions, increased pay, and freedom from censorship on the government programs. In fact, the largest mass arrest in New York City history, at least up until 1936, took place on December 1, 1936, when 219 artists were arrested at the Federal Art Project headquarters protesting budget cuts. They were hauled off in patrol wagons and booked on charges of disorderly conduct. An artist remembered the antic scene. "Your name," bellowed an officer, pad and pencil in hand. "Jim Picasso," came the first response. That was a sufficient cue. Cezanne, Da Vinci, and Peter Bruegel followed. Art Front, the organ of the Artists Union, appeared in November 1934 with the stated goal of uniting all artists in their struggle for economic security and to encourage a wider distribution and understanding of art. Stuart Davis edited the journal for a time and designed the May 1935 cover, featuring abstracted tools of the trade and banners announcing union demands for extension of art projects, for social insurance, for free expression, with May 1st, International Workers' Day, stamped in purple. Though George Biddle is often credited as the father of New Deal art through his 1933 letter to FDR, artist Phil Bard argued that it is directly due to the formation, existence, and activities of the Artists Union that government projects on a large scale were brought into being. And remember, May is before the Federal Art Project had gotten underway. So this kind of pressure from the union, I think, really had an impact in terms of the government seeing it as being necessary to subsidize art. The Artists Union claimed that art is a natural resource of this country, not a luxury indulged in by private connoisseurs. There was hardly consensus. New Deal art programs became a lightning rod in debates about the role of art in a democracy. Communists and fellow travelers, some of them members of the Artists Union, seized on the projects as a chance to eliminate private patronage altogether. Cultural elites lamented fine art degraded to public service. Conservatives objected to wasteful boondoggling on shiftless or subversive artists. And by the end of the 1930s, an emboldened coalition of anti-New Dealers in Congress took aim at the art programs. Genuine artists would prefer the chains of poverty, insisted one congressman, to the sycophancy of government patronage. Fundamental tensions were never resolved. What did cultural democracy look like? How should it be implemented? How should a country, its history, citizens, and society be portrayed? By whom? These tensions continue to surface. Victor Arnautoff's FAP murals on the life of George Washington for a San Francisco high school sparked a national firestorm in 2019 when the city's Board of Education voted unanimously to paint them over. Arnautoff departed from textbook hagiographies and having the audacity to portray Washington as a slave owner whose push for westward expansion made him complicit in native genocide. Black and indigenous students, however, saw harmful imagery by a white artist that made for a hostile learning environment. Though a national outcry prompted the board to reverse its decision, the controversy is a reminder that New Deal art continues to pose thorny questions about monuments and memory, civics and censorship, art and democracy. Those opposed to destroying the Arnautoff murals reminded us in the school board that Arnautoff was a Russian-born communist painting against the grain of received American history. But it's undeniable that New Deal art, public murals, in many cases endorsed a white settler vision of history, glossed over or ignored realities of conquest, slavery, native genocide. A chapter in John Ott's forthcoming book, Mixed Media, I think shows irrefutably that section murals in the South, quote, documented, normalized, and perpetuated a system of white supremacy. Many trafficked in racial and ethnic stereotypes, a little small to see, but dangers of the male on the lower left is a particularly egregious example of a stagecoach massacre in Native Americans, kind of raiding, pillaging, raping. It's brutal, and it's kind of hard to imagine that it was on the walls of a public building. They cast men as muscular pioneers, women as domestic caregivers, non-white artists on the program, few of whom had supervisory roles, might be treated by white administrators as ethnic artisans rather than modern artists. Asian American artists such as Fei Chong, Mineo Kubo, and Aitaro Ishigaki overcame prejudice to achieve national recognition until the Second World War turned those of Japanese ancestry into enemy aliens. The WPA officially ended by presidential proclamation in 1934, with the country's shift to a war economy. US government would never subsidize art on anything like the scale or scope of the New Deal programs. The experience of an artist like Okubo, who published an eyewitness account of her experience in a wartime US internment camp, is a reminder that democracy is not an abstract concept, but an ongoing struggle. I think this might be one of the key legacies of New Deal art. For all their flaws and contradictions, the New Deal art programs, to date the most significant federal investment in the arts in US history, advanced a vision of art as essential to democracy: messy, contradictory, participatory democracy. Pressure campaigns from advocacy groups like the Artists Union and the Harlem Artists Guild led to greater opportunities for artists from marginalized communities. Building on the momentum of the suffrage movement, women assumed key roles in New Deal arts administration, while artists like Gertrude Abercrombie, Marion Greenwood, Dorothea Lange, Helen Levitt, Alice Neal, and Augusta Savage made their marks as artists, teachers, and photographers. Paul Cadmus and Jared French queered the American scene with same-sex desire, overt or covert. Indigenous artists asserted native sovereignty on the walls of federal buildings. Latino artists, Pedro Cervantes and Patrocinio Barella, earned national praise as discoveries of the art programs. Artists from diverse backgrounds claimed their right to self-representation, reinterpreted American history and identity, organized to protect mutual interests, participated in democracy as a collective project. And it was a decade when democracy itself was at stake. In an atmosphere of heightened fear and anxiety, New Deal artists confronted the twin crises of domestic depression and the global rise of fascism. The conditions for democracy and for art are one and the same, FDR said in a 1938 speech. Nourish the conditions of a free life and you nourish the arts too. The arts are especially malnourished these days. You all could probably predict where I was going with all of this. We've seen the headlines. Recent assaults on agencies like the General Services Administration, which is the custodian of federal art, and was already operating on a skeleton crew, as well as libraries, museums, universities, sort of functioned like FDR's first 100 days in a kind of surreal reverse. While fighting these threats tooth and nail, I think it's worth keeping in mind that even under normal circumstances, virtually no artists today make a living from making and selling art. They struggle with student debt, affordable housing, healthcare access. Unlike many other countries, the US has no Ministry of Culture. The arts rely on a patronage patchwork of state agencies, foundations, nonprofits. Assuming the National Endowment for the Arts and the Humanities gets funded at all, which is not guaranteed at the moment, even under the best of circumstances, its funding varies based on which party holds the purse strings and rarely amounts to more than 0.004% of the federal budget. Embers of the New Deal still burn. Audiences are discovering New Deal artists such as Sargent Johnson, Norman Lewis, Alice Neal, and Charles White through major museum retrospectives. You've all probably noticed, and I've certainly been excited by all the recent exhibitions on art of the 1930s, looking at this period again. It was Art for the Millions at the Met. St. Louis Museum had an exhibition recently. Baltimore Museum of Art had a show about women printmakers in the 1930s. The Dykstra collection traveled on the West Coast, Art for the People. And all of this activity and energy, I think, reminds us of the variety and vitality of 1930s art. I just want to call attention, as I conclude, to the Living New Deal, which is an organization dedicated to raising awareness of the New Deal's history and legacy. I'd encourage anyone interested to check out the website, get involved. They had, I think, Jackie, Erica, a major NEH grant rescinded recently, so they're actually looking to try and make up some of the difference through a grant matching donations. As part of its mission, the Advocating for New Deal Art initiative was established to broaden public interest in New Deal art and to serve as a resource for its study, preservation, and teaching. Additionally, the Living New Deal acts as a watchdog group for federal artworks threatened by the ravages of time, censorship, neglect, or Elon Musk's chainsaw. So by safeguarding the past in all its complexity, the Living New Deal helps preserve a model of cultural democracy for the future. I'm sure Jackie or Erica would be happy to talk more about it if you have questions for them. It's a model we desperately need. At a moment when public arts funding is under attack, fine art remains largely the purview of the wealthy and well-educated. The dream of cultural democracy remains a radical one. In November 1940, with Europe in flames and the US on the brink of war, reporters asked Eleanor Roosevelt if the world's critical conditions allowed time for art. If not, she answered, life would hardly be worth living. Rekindling the dream of cultural democracy, the belief in art as a human right and a public good, the very thing that makes life worth living, begins with retracing steps to the New Deal. Its aspirations remain unfulfilled. On my more optimistic days, and I have to say, being here yesterday, all the great conversations we're having, I can even hope that the New Deal's dream of cultural democracy may not be behind us, but ahead of us. Thank you. Time for just one or two questions. Sorry, I ran a little long.
Let me go around.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. I suggest that you bold and enlarge the names of the artists. They're very hard to see
Thank you.
back here.
They look so nice on my screen. Thank you. Yeah. Good,
well,
good
your talk
suggestion.
is so interesting that I've been squinting my eyes, and I'm middle-aged, so. But that wasn't my big point.
No, totally.
I have a question, related questions. A number of post offices with murals have closed. Some of them have been torn down. In my current hometown of Allentown, PA, the building is fabulous with Moravian tiles on the floor, Gifford Beale murals. I don't know what's going to happen to all that. Are murals in other post offices usually oil on canvas applied to the wall? Is there any definitive attempt to save the murals when the buildings are obsolete?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I appreciate that. I was talking with Chris actually at dinner last night about it was sort of fortunate that not a lot of artists had experience with true fresco, sort of painting on plaster. The benefit was the oil on canvases would be put up on the walls and they can be taken down and rolled up. But so much art has been lost. The General Services Administration is technically the guardian of this material and is trying to track it. But as I said, they were already a skeleton crew to begin with. And with the cuts, I think it's hard for a small staff to keep track of everything that's happening. One of the reasons the Living New Deal, I think, is really important. I think there's actually on the website, there's sort of current controversies or current threats, post offices that might be being closed or sold for development. So they're keeping an eye on it and they're encouraging people, constituents in those areas to be very vocal about their hope that the work at least be preserved. Sometimes they'll be moved. There have been encouraging examples of work that was discovered in a basement or in a storage facility that is brought out and restored and put in a different public building like a library. So there are examples or reasons to feel optimistic, but yeah, a lot of it has been lost over time, and we're really relying on a pretty small group of people who are actively interested to try and keep the flame alive. So thanks for the question.
Hi. I loved what you said about how during this time of patronage, the artists became more collaborative and less competitive. And I'm curious whether there were other sort of social organizations or what the social scene was like besides the unions.
Yeah, no, great question. So I think artists at the time, one thing I didn't have time to get into was this was a decade of really active union organizing and activism across the country in a lot of different fields. So a lot of the artists who set up the artists union belong to something called the John Reed Club, which was a club that was kind of the cultural arm of the Communist Party USA, you might say. And they were really quite militant and strident about the idea of art being broadly accessible, trying to get away from private patronage. So that was another example. The American Artists Congress was also formed as a kind of spinoff from the Artists Union to deal more directly with the threat of fascism, both global and domestic. So I think there was just generally this spirit of kind of organizing, collective action. I think artists were very much identifying with the idea that we're workers, we need to organize to protect our mutual interests. That was something Davis had said very explicitly. And it sounds like they threw a lot of great parties. Always good, always a good bonding experience. With watered down gin, yeah. Thanks for the question. Is that it? Great, thank you. Thanks everyone.